Aloha mai kākou. It's a pleasure to be here with you all at this summit, this 1898 summit. I want to give you a little bit of background for this extraordinary opportunity. Tom and I were talking over a year ago, and he mentioned that there was an exhibition at the Smithsonian that was going up. And we both looked at each other and I said, well, I'll be in Chicago, that's close enough. So off I went to DC, because the best thing for all of us to know, and the children that we work with, is they have to see and they have to feel and they have to do. So I had to go to see this exhibition called American Empire, Imperialism, in the Pacific. And that might not be the exact title, but don't hold me to it. But just know I went to DC to see this. I even brought the catalog and these books up here. The important part is for all of us to say now, how can we understand the larger issues in terms of this project? So Mr. Tom Coffman and I finished a film on Mauna Kea, and it's been so much fun. We've been just looking for things to do. Just kidding. This is in 2023, it was the 125th anniversary of America's passage into overseas imperialism and the formation of an empire. So this 1898 project builds on the learning experience of this observance, and also of the illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom and all imposed annexation. So for me, it's personal. These are relatives up here. Aimanawa, he was my great-grand aunt. Joseph, they helped to put the petitions together. So many of us in this room are connected to these events of not only 1898, but today. And our wonderful committee, I wish I had my notes for all the committee members. Okay, you know who you are. Amy, could you please, and who else? You guys stand up. Okay, this is for people who know what they're doing. Hello. Thank you, Colin. Where's Willie, Craig, Tom Coffman, John Waihe'e? And we had these great ideas. So here's the result of all of this. And we have a panel that will be up shortly, but I actually really want to invite our scholar friend here. I paint pictures, I make films, I do murals, but this talking thing is a little challenging. So I just want to say we're happy you're here. This is going to be a wonderful conference, and this is just the beginning of this project, because we all have to do the work to break down the silos, find out what each of our countries are doing, and be able to help each other, assist in decolonizing and articulating what our needs and wishes are for healing, for restitution, I dare say, and for all other things in terms of education. We want our children to be educated. We want our children to know. And I also want to thank a beloved dear friend, Malia Nobriga, because she's pushed out all of this information. She's also part of the Hawaii Pono'i Coalition, of which I'm a member. And we do work in September all month for the Hawaiian History Month. And all of those things are important because we're just kind of generating energy and better understanding for all things Hawaii, the Pacific, and for our brothers and sisters throughout the world. And I'm going to introduce Tom Coffman. Tom? Yeah.
Okay, mahalo. Aloha, everyone. I'm so glad to see everyone. There's a story at work here, and it is, I think, a story of growing awareness of what has shaped our history, and that it is getting both deeper and broader. Our antecedents here, there are many antecedents, okay? There are the antecedents from the 19th century and from the early 20th century and so on, but the most immediate antecedents are the observance in 1993, which brought 30,000 or so people to the palace to protest the overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom. And that was followed by another round of history development in 1998, which was the 100th anniversary of the forced illegal annexation of Hawaii to the United States. And now we're at 125, and we're trying to, and I think we're engaged in advancing our understanding and deepening our commitment. I look around and I see many people who have contributed to, bringing us this far. While I'm finishing, could I ask our panel to come up, and we will get this started. Vernadette and Cristel and there we go. Okay. Thank you, Matthew. After many, many months of being involved in this, about 10 minutes ago, I lost my notebook. Basically, the question, there's a grid of simple questions for the panel, and the first is there something you've prepared to talk about, and if so, please feel free to do. But as a generalization, what is it that brought you to this point in your work? And in this gathering, in this community we're working on forming, what is your hope for it? And if you do have a priority or a specific, please spell it out. In the conversations that have led up to it, the subjects that rose to the top were militarism, and militarization, and demilitarization. Expropriation of land and water resources, damage to the environment, damage to the water resource, damage to the aquifers, and then a powerful impulse that I think is working at the grassroots level, which is reclamation, reclaiming, restoring land and water, deoccupying and decolonization. And so those are my hopes for the conference in terms of discussion. And is there an order that you folks want to appear in? What, Vernadette's going to start us off. Vernadette is from Hawaii, but most recently from the University of California at Berkeley.
I feel a little funny being up here because I look out at the audience and I feel like y'all should be up here instead, and I should be learning from you. Yeah, that's true. Everyone else will have a turn, so don't worry. Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel and this conference. So the study of American imperialism was already in the air when I began my graduate studies over 25 years ago. So this is not to say that American imperialism wasn't of interest. It certainly was to the people and in the territories that the US empire carved out, who by and large don't necessarily mark their resistance according to big anniversaries, right? But there was something to the centennial of 1898 and the way that it showed up in academic spaces and academic writing at that moment. So perhaps much of it had to do with a paradigm shift entailed by empire, right? Having to relearn and recognize US imperialism. But in that moment, I think it was happening in a way that still centered the United States as the unit of analysis, right? Like from which empire emanated. So for me specifically, 1898 Centennial materialized through a graduate seminar. So I just went back to my alma mater, and so I'm having these moments of sort of remembrance and recognition. It was a graduate seminar on US empire with Jose David Saldivar, and a small conference at Stanford called The Bastards of US Imperialism. And these two moments gave me a way to approach questions about mobility, on freedom, desire, and the specificity of island places. I had grappled with US imperial history and occupation in the Philippines specifically as part of my interest in what was then, my interest then in a Filipino-American literature. But I had not broadly considered the vast and interconnected coalition the coalition that we're seeing now, right? But the ambition that would of U.S. empire that sort of defines this coalition, and how the Philippines was just one small node, right, in an imperial constellation. So that was where I was as a grad student. But for me, the class mapped new geographies across the North American West, south to Latin America, into the Caribbean and the Pacific, right, in the formal extraterritorial leap. It was a primer in understanding how American interests and desire for hemispheric hegemony drove foreign policy and military investment in close collaboration with a jingoistic press. And we're seeing this, of course, again today. So that moment was about understanding the US imperium as a structure, its conditions, not just sort of the economic explanation for empire as a mode of capitalism, but the historical patterns, right? The habits of being, the cultural alibis that ease a nation into an imperial mindset. So in that seminar, I learned about the imperial apparatus, how one technique or technology tested out in one colonial laboratory might be applied to another, right? So the things, the reconcentrados in Cuba, used in the Philippines, right? The deployment of Black soldiers also in Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines, right? So you're seeing these patterns, the familiarity and ease of Indian War and its repetition. So the connection between, for instance, the pacification campaign in the Philippines and the annexation of Hawaiʻi, right, in that moment of that historical moment here. So in the 25 years since, what has also become more and more apparent and exciting is how scholarship, activism, art, community-based work have taken root and allowed us to reframe 1898 from the perspective of those whose lives continue to be shaped by its legacies. So for me, this body of work is incredibly critical and generative. It's critical in the sense of crucial and in the sense of corrective, right? Drawing on important perspectives and drawing on archives that shift our understanding of 1898 and illuminate the complex political and cultural lives of the people and places that that moment shaped. It's generative in the sense of world building outside of and beyond the framework of US imperialism. So here, I mean the kinds of networks and relationalities of anti-colonialism and decolonialism that have formed, especially around demilitarization and climate change activism. And I see so many people here who do that work today, and I'm just, trying not to cry because it's just amazing. So I think about this present moment too, and what kinds of new mappings and affinities we might foreground today and in this weekend, given that all the sites we represent today remain in the orbit of US power and US warmongering. So how, for instance, might we overlay what we have learned about US imperialism, colonial resistance, and decolonial futures onto the current imperial devastation in Palestine? How might we map the connections we have learned to make between our places and people so that we understand how Palestine is also part of our story, of this story, and the futures that we make from here on in, right? So, I'm thinking about the bases that we have here, the bases that we're seeing sort of come back again in the Philippines, even after a supposed, American departure, how these are part of an active military machine wreaking havoc, right? And so this is why we're hearing the chant in marches from Palestine to the Philippines, stop the US war machine, right? So I'm just kind of thinking about all these connections like Puerto Rico and Hawaii post-disaster rebuilding and predatory disaster capitalism. I'm just really, really angry about this headline I saw a few weeks ago about Jared Kushner talking about beach real estate in Gaza. So that kind of thing is still happening, right? So I find it particularly meaningful and amazing that this conference today, right, 125 years, is being held in Hawaii with a purposefulness that decenters the US as agent and subject. And for me, this place, I've taken hula classes here with my kumu, right? I've been nurtured so much by this place and the friends and family I've made here. So I'm especially looking forward to learning from my students that I see and my former students who are at the forefront of this work and who are dreaming up the kinds of futures that they deserve.
Hafide, Nanusi Mary Hattori. I am from the island of Guam and have been asked to share a little bit about a Pacific perspective as well as perspective from Guam, which I will also do in the third session today. So I'll save some of my thoughts for that and try to be as brief as possible. First of all, I want to thank the organizers. Too often we Pacific Islanders and we who have inherited the legacies of 1898 are often the topics of discussion by outsiders. And so I was quite impressed when I saw the diversity and the appropriate representation of people speaking about their own communities, for their own communities from direct lived experience. I was at the 1898 kickoff in the National Gallery, the first panel. Some of you may have been there. Was anyone in that discussion? No, it was a discussion similar to this with representative scholars from each of the impacted areas. The person speaking for Hawaii was foreign-born Haole, the only person not of the place that he was speaking of and for, and he proudly spoke on behalf of Hawaii and Hawaiians. It was quite offensive. And so when Craig reached out to me about this, I relayed that experience to him and said, I'm not participating if I'm gonna sit through a repeat of that with amazing Kanaka scholars in the front row, and this gentleman was selected by the Smithsonian for that panel. It was reprehensible and quite a disgusting experience. So I appreciate the diversity and the thought that's been put into this. Like Meliana said, this is a personal topic for us. This is not simply a scholarly endeavor for us. So as you listen to us today and tomorrow, and not just us, but I speak collectively with humility, as you listen to us and our thoughts, perspectives, and stories, try to appreciate the personal cost that this enacts on us. We are often asked to speak about topics like this, and the people who are asking, the people in the audience, just assume that we are academics, and for us this is academic, but it's not. So this is a special event because you're hearing again from people, like Meliana said, this is personal. So I want you to keep that in mind as we go through this summit. And for those of you who plan events like this, be mindful of that, right? Be mindful of the personal, emotional cost that you are asking us and people like us to give. Based on my work as director of the Pacific Islands Development Program, well, actually, before I say that, one of the reasons I am connected to this is because in 1998, or prior to 1998, many people like us were involved in similar projects. Resistance in Paradise is a book that was put together, and you can get this online, and I'll put it up here so you can see it. It's rethinking 100 years of US involvement in the Caribbean and the Pacific. So it's the 1898 project back in 1998. So I'm troubled because I feel like I'm in a time loop. The conversations are the same. The impacts to our people are the same. The scars are the same. In some places, including the North Pacific, it's worse. Militarization is worse. Another publication is Unfaithing US Colonialism. This is a collection of literary works by people representing the countries affected by US imperialism in 1898. So this Unfaithing US Colonialism, really good thing. So I thinking about today, it strikes me that we really haven't made progress. US imperialism is alive and well in Oceania. You'll hear more about that later, about militarism. We have been infected by imperialism. We continue to perpetuate American imperialistic cultural norms on each other. And I think we need to think about why we do it. The whole point of, one point of the summit is that we understand the legacies, but we also have to think about why we keep doing it, why we as indigenous peoples of these colonized places continue to perpetuate colonial attitudes towards each other. And why this continues in the state of Hawaiʻi. I've lived here since the early 80s, and my first experiences of racism and sexism have occurred in Hawaiʻi. I never knew racism or sexism as a person, as an individual, until I came to Hawaiʻi. And that hasn't changed. I want to share 3 instances. Well, I shared the first, right? This Hawaiʻi scholar representing Hawaiians, and it's perfectly okay for him to do this in a national meeting. I just came back from Rapa Nui, and I was at the Pacific Island Leaders Summit. The summit was focused on plastics, and I was there to talk about some of the national policy level discussions around international policies in Oceania and the regional architecture. In these kinds of summits, the VIPs, the the delegates of every nation, the United Nations, are seated in the front at tables with their flags, country flags or island flags in front of them. And then the audience is seated behind them. As the head of, PIDP is a member of what's known as the Council of Regional Organizations of the Pacific. So in my role as director, as head of a crop agency, I was seated at one of those tables. And to my far right was a haole gentleman who was representing Hawaiʻi, sitting proudly behind the Hawaiian flag. When again, amazing Kanaka scholars were sitting in the bleachers behind him. The explanation was that the mayor, one of our mayors, who also happens to be Hawaiian, hired him to represent Hawaiʻi. So again, it was justified, right? In protest, I refused to sit at the table. Walked out when he presented, and I'm so happy because he his presentation was sort of an insult to the Native Hawaiians in the room. He spoke about plastics and was making connections to climate and the Kumulipo, representing himself as of the islands when he actually is not. And without the mana to speak of the Kumulipo. I mean, it's just wrong on so many levels. And yet he was enabled to do this by a politician in the state of Hawaiʻi. Recently, so that's one example. I was involved in a project, preparation for rematriation of a number of our ancient latte stones. These are our ancestors, housed at a museum, actually, in many of them in the open, behind an abandoned building under decades of weeds and debris. They were discovered a couple of years ago, and I won't go into too much detail, but the Chamorro reporter who wrote about this in a local publication referred to our laddie as remnants numerous times in her article. They are not remnants. These are the bodies of our ancestors. She refused to include the genealogy of all of the people involved in uncovering them, initiating the rematriation activities and discussions, absolutely refused to make substantive corrections in her story, claiming that the people who had concerns, who she interviewed, merely had stylistic concerns. She had no cultural competence, yet she claimed to have cultural competence because of her heritage. Also working in a Hawaii-based news organization, right? So when push comes to shove, she says, well, these are the editorial guidelines of our institution, which make no room for cultural competence or cultural sensitivities. We have to question why we continue to allow these things to happen. Why is it okay for local news media to continue to report with cultural insensitivity, to speak of us and our people, Pacific Islanders, in pejorative terms, and of our beloved ancestors in pejorative terms? She framed the whole thing as a healing process with no agency ascribed to the Chamorros involved in this process. We've been infected, and I hope that today we start the process of working against that. Since I'm going to be on 2 other panels, I'm going to stop there and end with a poem from my sister, Dr. Ann Perez Hattori, who is actually a scholar of 1898, so I feel a little always humbled because she's far more, she is the expert on this from a Chamorro perspective, one of the leading historians of Chamorro history. And she has a piece in this called Forefathers. Our forefathers, with their white wigged hair and exquisite accents, delusive diplomacy, quieted conquistadorial cruelty. Our forefathers, like Washington and Jefferson, Franklin and Lincoln. Who are these gentle men anyway, whose faces flatter bulletin boards and whose manifestos are memorized by school children island-wide? Did they sweat sweet tropical perspiration? Did they plant Suni and pick lemai and beseech the blessings of Guelas, Zenguelus, our ancestors, under the sweltering sun of latitude 14? So why do we, yes, we, teach that they are everything or something or even anything to us? Chamorro natives who work the soil, ride the sea, inhale our exhalations, and inherit the land immortally. Mahalo.
Thank you so much. I want to thank the organizers for this really incredible opportunity to be here in Hawaii to speak in, I think, what's such an important symposium summit on the legacies of 1898. Myself and Matthew here, we are coming from New York City, from the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College. I'd like to tell you a little bit more about the work that Centro does and how that's important to why we're here today. So Centro was founded in 1973 by a coalition of students, faculty, and activists. And it is the largest university-based research institute, library, and archive dedicated to the Puerto Rican experience in the United States. So it's really important for me to always remember that Centro exists because of activist students who fought for space for Puerto Rican and Black students at the CUNY, the City University of New York system. And really it is, our archives is mostly focused on the Puerto Rican diaspora. And most people think of places like New York, Chicago, or more recently, Central Florida, when they think about Puerto Rican migration to the United States. But actually, it is not well known the first large-scale migration of Puerto Ricans to the United States was actually to Hawaii. The first group actually stopped in California on the way here, but their destination was Hawaii. In 1899, just 1 year after the US invasion, Puerto Rico was ravaged by Hurricane San Ciriaco. After the storm, thousands of Puerto Ricans were recruited by the Hawaiʻi Sugar Planters Association to come to the Hawaiian archipelago to work on sugar and pineapple plantations. This story is completely unknown to me growing up. It's not a story that we learn in schools. And it's something that I wanted to mention, at least in Puerto Rico, so much of our history, education in history ends in 1898. We don't really learn about contemporary history, right? We learn about Spanish colonization. We learn about the US invasion in 1898, and the rest is sort of like, it's not there, right? And then if you do go on to study humanities in the university, then you really start learning about really important moments of resistance and histories of solidarity and of resistance to US imperialism that isn't really something that you learn growing up, right? It is just such an emphasis of we are, this beautiful blend of like the Spanish, the African, and the Taino, the indigenous Puerto Ricans, right? And it's this beautiful mestizaje that makes the Puerto Rican people. And that's not really questioned, right? And then on top of that, you get these narratives about how, the US is our great protector. We would be nothing without the US. We would starve without the United States. And that's why it's so important to maintain this special relationship, right? And I think that is still very common in the ways that history is taught to Puerto Ricans, right? But if you do start delving deeper, you are going to start seeing a lot of these contradictions. And it's been really sort of illuminating diving into this history, which I think a big reason why we're here, right? And this particular history about Puerto Ricans in Hawaii was unknown to me until I read a short story by a Puerto Rican writer. His name is Manuel Ramos Otero. I'm trained in literary studies, and my work mostly focuses on activism, art, and literature during the HIV/AIDS epidemic in Puerto Rico, the United States, and some parts of Latin America. And this story, called Vivir del Cuento, was originally published in 1989, shortly before the author's death due to complications of HIV/AIDS. And in this story, the author meets a Puerto Rican woman who has spent over 30 years in Hawaii. And through her, he learns about a community that has toiled and persisted for almost 100 years at the point of publication. And now, being at Centro, I have learned so much about this history, documented through Blaise Camacho Souza's paper. She's a Puerto Rican woman who grew up in Hawaii and who made it her life's mission to document the Puerto Rican community in the Hawaiian archipelago. And if you get a chance over at the registration table, we have some cards that can link to the materials in her collection that have been digitized. And it's been a really incredible experience diving into those papers and seeing just the history of Puerto Ricans here, but also how they have worked to maintain their traditions and their culture alive, so far away from Puerto Rico. And there are so many things that we could say to start this conversation, but I think sort of going back to the reason why these Puerto Ricans came here in the first place, there was a hurricane, right? And how the histories of, predatory, post-disaster capitalism is not a new thing. We have been living for this for hundreds of years at this point, right? And whether 125 years ago it was San Ciriaco, more recently it's been Hurricanes Irma and Maria in Puerto Rico, wildfires in Maui. With this in mind, it's so important to have the opportunity to have these conversations outside of the sort of binary that we usually have in Puerto Rico, where we only talk about 1898 in the context of Spain, the great disaster that it was for Spain to lose their colonies in 1898, of the arrival of the United States in 1898, for debates on whether annexation is still the path towards, for Puerto Rico, which is a huge conversation whether we want to maintain this sort of status quo where we're like part of the US, but we're not. Many people feel that being this colony is the best way forward, right? And for me, it's so important to break out of these conversations that we've been having over and over and over and learn from Hawaiians, learn from the Chamorro people, learn from Filipinos, and really get a larger perspective of, what are, the shared legacies of empire, and how it is learning these histories and talking to each other that we can really build bridges of solidarity, and learning our shared histories of resistance. And I'll give it to Matthew there.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the invitation, and and congratulations to the conveners. This is really humbling and it's quite a privilege to be here. I should point out that I am not Puerto Rican. I am Filipino American from New Jersey. But that said, and to kind of touch on your prompt about how did I get here, 1898, I think, is kind of my intellectual awakening. I was an undergrad. I was an undergrad when, that moment in which the US realized that it was an empire again. And as someone who grew up in New York City, it was so strange that we come to know 1898, and you always hear about Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and Hawaii, and yet I didn't know any of that history, right? And, with my friends who were, New York City is a huge center for the Spanish Caribbean diaspora, and so the fact that I could see them, right? Because my parents would always remind us, Filipinos are Spanish, Chinese, and so these myths, and then of course I go to my Latino friends, and they have no idea where the Philippines is or why we have Spanish last names, and it's always like that need to have to explain to people why that is, and why don't you see me? And so I think that has kind of driven my own work. I am a literary and visual studies scholar, and I work on the Philippines and Puerto Rico in the 19th century. And it really is trying to kind of, think about what were those connections and why is it and when is it that we're able to see each other. I think that was, we had our 1898 symposium back in October, and I think these were some of the questions we wanted to ask. And I think, as some of my fellow panelists have mentioned, commemorations of 1898 is so U.S. empire-centric, right? And I think that was also some of our own qualms with the National Portrait Gallery exhibit. And so, I think, I want to say what the exhibit did, I think, allow, and I think I apologize, and it's I'm sad that I don't know the histories or the cultures of Hawaii, and I feel like I should have known that, right? And so I go to the Smithsonian to see this exhibit, and it's just made me realize that there's just so many gaps, and I'm just I don't understand how that happens, and so I am appreciative that they put that to the forefront, and I'm wondering, I know the exhibit's over, but instead of following the trajectory of the museum, I thought it was more interesting to kind of just zigzag across the exhibit. As much as they tried to create a dialogue, they failed because they did silo Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and Guam. But if you zigzagged, you wonder, it makes you start thinking, what were those conversations? And one of the photos that the exhibit brought up, which I don't think anybody from the histories of Cuba, Puerto Rico, or the Philippines knows, was this photograph of representatives of the three colonies meeting in a hotel in Washington, D.C. And I'm wondering, we have no documentation of that history, right? What were they talking about? They clearly they must have gathered because they knew that there was something shared there. And so, for me, one of the questions is, the way we think about our own individual histories, are we implicit in kind of erasing those histories of connection and moments of overlap? I think that's just one moment, and I'm trying to look a little bit more into where were those other moments, right? And I understand, I guess it's for perhaps my accidental place of birth in New York has privileged me to think about the Philippines with Puerto Rico. But you know, I think again, I guess one of the questions I want to ask here, and it's a question that I had asked during the symposium, is it only during moments of disaster that we see each other? Is there other ways and times that we can see each other not as a mirror of ourselves, but to see each other for who we individually are and what our histories are? But yes, I'll keep it at that. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. And we're at 2 o'clock, but you know, let's not be on time. Let's talk a little bit. Are there people in the audience who want to make a point or ask a question? Please come forward, speak up.
Hello to you all. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting over the short throat. I have a question I'd like to ask Dr. Hattori. First of all, thank you for the connection so clearly between the personal and the academic. So as a longtime resident here and also previous student and faculty member at UHM, I have knowledge about the East-West Center, and I'd be interested in you perhaps telling a little bit about what space you find for your views and your perspective within the context of the East-West Center, which has had from my perspective, a long and troubled history and embeddedness with the US. So, and I know you're in charge of the Pacific Island Development Program.
Thank you for that very loaded question. And I had a note here that I have a disclaimer that these views are my own. I forgot to say this at the start. These views are my own and not those of the East-West Center. Seriously, that is actually in my my notes, and your question reminds me that I need to say that, and the fact that I need to say that is a challenge for me. I take heart in the fact that I'm director of the Pacific Islands Development Program, which, as I said, is a member of the Council of Regional Organizations of the Pacific. We operate in the regional space, in some spaces where the United States actually is not involved except on the periphery. So that gives me a measure of freedom and a measure of independence. We are also the Secretariat of the Pacific Islands Conference of Leaders. And having Governor Waihee here, who represented Hawaii often in convenings, it's at leaders level 20 members, including the independent Pacific and the US affiliated territories and the state of Hawaii. So again, because of our role as Secretariat, we also have a measure of independence from the East-West Center. But it's a very tense relationship because we are housed in a center that is, you know, most of the East-West Center's funding comes through congressional appropriations. And as most of us know, the American culture is quite transactional, right? It's all about who's paying for what, right? So while the Pacific Islands Conference of Leaders sits within the East-West Center and should act independently for the best interests of the Pacific Island countries and members, because we are funded in large part by US Congress, there is an assumption by East-West Center leadership and others that we roll out programs, we arrange events in convenings of Pacific leaders to the benefit of the United States government. We do serve a good role in being a bridge between the US and the Pacific Islands. And we try to remind East-West Center leadership, very fortunate to have Governor Waihee on the board so he can help us with sending this message to East-West Center leadership and the board that for the Pacific, it's relationships that matter. It's relational, not transactional. our actions must keep that in mind. And so we try to maintain a balance. And it is difficult, but it's not impossible. And so we are in a very good moment in time because all eyes are on the Pacific. There's a lot happening in our area in terms of geopolitical competition. And so we leverage that heightened interest in the Pacific to our benefit, to the benefit of Pacific Islanders. So people are listening to us more. Leadership will listen to us more simply because the U.S. has a greater strategic interest in the Pacific Islands. And so one of my mottos at work is to be subversive as much as possible. And so that's sort of the way we approach, or the way I approach things in the East-West Center. But it certainly is not easy. But thank you for the question.
Thank you. Are there other questions? You have a question? A comment? Okay, there's two. Here we go. Go ahead.
Aloha, hafade, hola, mabuhay. Mahalo for your powerful opening remarks to kick off this summit. It has really helped to set the tone and the intentions, so mahalo. Ms. Hattori, you spoke to feeling like you're in a time loop. And I was hoping that you could maybe share some comments on how perhaps it wouldn't feel like like you're experiencing a time loop, and how in 20 years it wouldn't feel like we're stuck in this time loop. And if others also feel that way, if you could also share comments. Mahalo.
I'm encouraged by events like this because I believe that multi-generational events like this, where we are sitting with our students, and I see many young people in the audience, that you will change things. You're aware, you're seeing people like us say things that make everyone in the room uncomfortable, but we're saying it anyway. You're seeing the organizers create a safe space like this so that these things can be said, right? And so we hope that you will make the changes that are needed. We need greater civic engagement from young people, right? And I'll talk about this a little later, but in Micronesia, many of the Micronesian citizens who live in Hawaii and the United States are extremely, the level of civic engagement is very high. Their voting record is very high. They're very well organized. The parents. The children who are born in America don't vote, right? Think about your classmates, the students who are in here. Think about yourselves. What are your voting rates? You need to move into positions of power to make change, right? We need to, well, you know,
Okay,
I'm making change as director of PIDP because I'm a Pacific Islander. My predecessor, decades long, was not a Pacific Islander. We need to be at the table so that we can make those changes.
Thank you. You had a
You need to be at
comment.
the table.
Thank you.
Aloha. Thank you for this great event. I wanted to sort of share a story, especially for the Central people and the Hawaiians here, with like the comment that I'm Filipina but not American. So I'm happy that this event is happening and that the Native Hawaiian Student Services too, because I arrived early for the geography conference next week. And I wanted to share a story of how I was recently teaching in Germany, where I'm based, a Puerto Rican student who didn't know anything about Puerto Rico or about Hawaii or about the Philippines. And because I did my PhD about Filipinx solidarity and Aloha Aina, teaching about Hawaiian philosophy and Peruvian philosophy. And he was so excited to actually be learning and connecting these stories. And he wasn't getting credit for it because the university sort of forced me out and banned the class. And I think the student might have also left, but I was also telling him that maybe several years down the line, we'll know why we met at a German university where I'm teaching him Hawaiian and Peruvian philosophies and about, developing Filipino philosophies, and also sharing with him stories about Puerto Rico that he didn't know as an East Coast Puerto Rican. And so I just wanted to share that he was so excited to learn about Aloha Aina and Kumu John Sawyer's books that I wish it had in my syllabus and all those things. So I really want to, also encourage students to really mix their activism and learning of these stories. And again, like the point is, I'm here early because I'm not American and I had to rely on the visa and the passport things. But if I didn't have a second passport as a Filipino, that would be even harder.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's give the panel a big hand and